In a small but bustling town courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of everyday cases, the quiet shuffle of paperwork, and the distant echo of voices as people moved about their business. There was a sense of order in the air that seemed to promise predictability and routine. As Alicia Lawson stepped into the building, she felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. Though it was an ordinary trip, for most it was far from that for her today. Dressed in a sharp tailored suit with her long hair pulled back into a simple but elegant bun, Alicia moved with a grace that commanded attention without demanding it. Her dark skin and poised demeanor made her stand out among the other citizens in the room who were either too distracted by their own problems or too caught up in their routines to notice who she was yet. Alicia had long since become accustomed to moments like this, walking among crowds of people who had no idea that she was the governor of the state, the woman who had risen from humble beginnings to take on one of the most powerful roles in the country. But she didn't let her title define her, not today, not in a place like this. As she waited for her name to be called, she observed the judge who would be overseeing her case, Judge Richard Langford, He sat on his bench with an air of authority, his middle-aged face framed by glasses, and his hands resting on a set of documents before him. He had already heard dozens of cases, that morning each one more mundane than the last, and his expression remained one of routine weariness. Alicia couldn't help but notice the air of entitlement that surrounded him, as if he was above the very people he was meant to serve. Finally, her name was announced. Alicia stood and walked calmly to the front of the room. She held her head high, making eye contact with the judge, but not in a way that sought confrontation, merely acknowledgement. Langford barely looked up from his papers as he motioned for her to present her case. His voice was dismissive when he finally spoke the words, "So what seems to be the problem here, Miss Lawson?" Alicia replied in a measured tone, explaining that her license plate had been mistakenly flagged by the system. She had already corrected the issue and paid the fine, but she was here today to clear up the misunderstanding. Langford barely registered her explanation. His eyes were already flicking to the next case on his docket. He didn't have time for what he likely considered trivial matters, but Alicia could see that his mind was set and her words were not changing it. Without looking up, he delivered his judgment. As if she were any other ordinary citizen in his courtroom, he imposed a fine on her without offering any room for further discussion. There was no acknowledgement of her position or influence in the state, no consideration that the woman before him was someone whose decisions could affect the lives of thousands across the region. To him, she was just another person, another case, another number. Alicia felt the weight of his indifference, but she didn't flinch. She remained calm and composed, nodding politely as she accepted the fine, her face giving away nothing of the anger or frustration that burned within her. She knew this was not just about a fine, it was about the subtle ways people like her were treated every day in this system, and she wasn't about to let it slide, not this time. As she turned and walked out of the courtroom, she felt the gaze of the room upon her. But she didn't look back. She wasn't finished yet. As Alicia left the courthouse, the weight of the incident didn't fully hit her until she stepped into the bright sunlight outside. The small town courthouse, with its aging brick walls and worn steps, faded behind her as she made her way toward the waiting car. Her assistant, Marcus Knight, a young, sharp-eyed man with a calm demeanor, stood by the vehicle, looking at his phone. He glanced up as she approached, noting the uncharacteristic stillness in her steps. Something was different today, but he said nothing. "Did everything go as expected?" Marcus asked with a polite smile, though his eyes searched hers for a hint of her true thoughts. Alicia didn't respond right away. She slid into the back seat of the car and closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering her thoughts. The incident was more than just an ordinary traffic violation, more than just a small courthouse hearing. It had triggered something deep within her. She had been dismissed, belittled even, by someone who had no idea who she truly was. The kind of judgment she had faced wasn't new. It was just the way the world often worked for people like her. "Yeah, everything went as planned," she replied finally, her voice steady. "Nothing we can't handle." Marcus got into the car and drove off, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Alicia stared out the window, lost in thought, her mind racing through the sequence of events that had unfolded in the courtroom. The judge, Richard Langford, had not even bothered to acknowledge her status, something that she was used to but never truly comfortable with. Most people saw her as a woman who had earned her place by hard work and grit, but to others, she was still just another black woman, subject to the rules of a system that rarely saw her as a peer. "I'm going to need you to stay on top of this," Alicia said after a moment. "It's time we use this to our advantage." Marcus turned his head slightly in surprise. He knew Alicia well enough to understand that when she spoke like this, it meant something bigger was brewing. He kept his voice neutral. "You think this will escalate?" Alicia's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I don't think. I know." She paused. "Let's see how the media handles it." Later that evening, Alicia's name was all over the local news. A small headline, barely noticeable amidst the other stories of the day, read, "State Governor fined for traffic violation in local court." But as the hours went by, the story gained momentum, picking up speed on social media and catching the eye of news outlets beyond the state. People began to ask questions. Why had the judge imposed such a harsh fine on the governor? Why had he treated her as if she were no different than any other citizen? Newsrooms across the state scrambled to find answers, digging into Alicia's background, uncovering the fact that she was the first black woman to serve as governor in the state's history. Her rise to power had been marked by years of perseverance, challenges, and barriers that few could even imagine. She had always been determined to push forward, but today, that determination would be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. Marcus had been right about one thing. This wasn't going to be just a small local story. The conversation had shifted quickly. From one small, inconsequential court case, the narrative had now turned into something much more significant. A powerful black woman in a position of authority had been treated unjustly by a system that didn't even recognize her for who she was. Alicia could already feel the shift. The question was, what would she do with it? As her phone began to ring with calls from reporters, Alicia knew this was just the beginning. The moment had arrived. The real battle wasn't about the fine. It was about making the world see what it had overlooked for so long. "Prepare a statement," she said to Marcus, her voice clear and commanding. It's time to tell the story. Judge Richard Langford sat in his study later that evening, nursing a glass of whiskey in his hand. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall, marking the passing of time with an almost mocking precision. The day's events kept replaying in his mind, each moment more uncomfortable than the last. He couldn't shake the image of Alicia Lawson standing before him, her calm demeanor belying the power she quietly held. The fine he'd imposed on her seemed insignificant now, but there was something far more disturbing, a feeling of regret he couldn't quite place. As the initial shock began to wear off, Langford's mind raced. How could he not have known who she was? The governor of the state, Alicia Lawson. The name now carried an entirely different weight. He'd heard it before, of course, seen it in headlines, and heard it mentioned in passing at social gatherings, but he'd never made the connection. To him, she had been just another person in the courtroom, a face among many, someone whose case was no different from any other. How naive he had been. His ego, his certainty that he was always right in his courtroom, had blinded him to the truth standing right in front of him. Langford grabbed his phone from the desk, scrolling through the notifications that had piled up since that morning. His colleagues had already begun to comment on the story, their messages filled with varying degrees of astonishment and disbelief. Some were supportive, trying to defend his actions, while others were simply shaking their heads, questioning how he could have missed such an obvious fact. The media was relentless. Reports flooded in from all sides, framing the incident not as a minor court decision, but as a glaring example of systemic issues in the justice system. The headlines had been unkind to him, each article more critical than the last, painting him as an out-of-touch figure who had failed to recognize the power and importance of the woman in front of him. But the public response wasn't what concerned Langford most. It was the growing realization that he had allowed his own biases to dictate his actions. The more he thought about it, the more ashamed he felt. Had he treated her this way simply because she was a woman, because she was black? He had been quick to dismiss her, quick to treat her as if she were just another person in a courtroom full of nameless, faceless individuals. And now, staring at his phone, he couldn't escape the truth. He had treated her this way because he hadn't seen her for who she really was. It wasn't just the fine that stung. It was the knowledge that Alicia had been reduced to nothing more than a case number in his eyes. And that was something he couldn't ignore. He had built his career on the idea that justice was blind, but today he had realized that sometimes it wasn't blind at all. It was clouded by assumptions, by biases, by a lack of understanding. Langford's grip on the glass tightened, the cool liquid inside swirling, as he tried to find some semblance of peace. He needed to do something, anything, to make this right. But how? Could he really fix this mistake? Could he make amends for something so deeply ingrained in the very system he represented? The thought of apologizing to Alicia seemed almost absurd. What good would that do? Yet it was the only thing he could think of. He set the glass down, his mind made up. He would have to reach out to her, explain himself, and try to repair the damage. But deep down, he knew that simply saying sorry would never be enough. The damage wasn't just between him and Alicia. It was a reflection of something much larger, something that needed to change, something that could no longer be ignored. For the first time in his career, Langford understood that the work ahead of him would not just be about fixing his mistake with one woman. It would be about understanding his place in a much bigger system. And that would be the hardest part of all. The following morning, Alicia sat in her office, watching the sun filter through the large windows of the state capitol. Her assistant Marcus entered with a stack of papers, but he was hardly holding them together, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a slight edge. "The phone lines are off the hook," he said, tossing the papers onto her desk. "The story is everywhere. It's gone viral." Alicia leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated the attention, but not to this extent. What had started as an innocuous moment in a small-town courthouse had quickly morphed into a state and then national debate. Her mind shifted through the possible outcomes, each one more complex than the last. In one sense, the public outrage worked in her favor, but in another, it opened her to a level of scrutiny she'd never experienced before. "What's the sentiment?" she asked, still calm, though her voice betrayed the slight tension she felt. "Overwhelmingly supportive," Marcus replied. "People are outraged on your behalf. Some are calling it an example of racial and gender bias in the judicial system. Others are rallying behind you for being so composed through it all. But there's also backlash from certain political circles. They're framing it as an attack on the justice system, calling you out for using your position to create drama." Alicia nodded slowly, processing the information. The backlash didn't surprise her. People who were invested in maintaining the status quo would always push back against those who questioned it. The response from her supporters, though, gave her the fuel she needed to stay the course. She had always known that her path to power would be difficult, that every step she took forward would be met with resistance. But today, the resistance was taking on a more public and dangerous form. At noon, Alicia was asked to appear on a local talk show. The interview was scheduled on short notice, but she had long since learned how to manage unexpected situations. When the cameras were turned on, she was composed and elegant, as always, but there was a new energy about her. This was no longer just about a personal inconvenience, it was about much more. The interviewer, a sharp-witted journalist with a knack for digging beneath the surface, wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "Governor Lawson," she began, "this courthouse incident has sparked an uproar. People are asking whether this is about a simple clerical error or if it's a reflection of deeper issues within our judicial system. What's your take?" Alicia didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment. "It's more than a clerical error," she said, her voice steady. "What happened in that courtroom is a symbol of a much larger problem. This is not just about me being treated unfairly. It's about how women of color, and frankly, anyone who isn't part of the established power structure, are often dismissed and dehumanized. It's about the biases that are built into the very systems that are supposed to protect us." The host pressed on. "But do you think it was intentional on the judge's part? Was this an example of outright prejudice? Alicia paused, considering her words carefully. It's not about intention, she said. It's about a lack of awareness, a failure to see the person in front of you for who they truly are. Judge Langford might not have meant harm, but his actions reflect a deeper problem, one that runs through institutions everywhere, where certain people are treated as less than. My hope is that we can learn from this, that we can start a real conversation about how we can do better, both as a society and as individuals. Her words struck a chord with the audience, and social media erupted in response. Clips of her interview were shared widely, each one capturing her calm, authoritative tone and the clarity of her message. Support flooded in from across the nation. Public figures, celebrities, activists, and everyday citizens voiced their solidarity with Alicia. For many, her calm response to the injustice she had faced became a symbol of strength and resilience. But as her public profile grew, so did the scrutiny. Political opponents who had long disagreed with Alicia's progressive policies seized upon the moment, accusing her of using the courthouse incident as a distraction from the state's real issues. They argued that she was inflaming racial tensions for political gain. It was a tactic that was as old as politics itself, trying to deflect from the real issue by framing the conversation as a personal vendetta. Yet, Alicia wasn't rattled. She had faced worse. And the more they pushed, the more her message resonated with the people who mattered most, the citizens she represented. The nation was watching, and Alicia knew that the stage had been set for something bigger than herself. This wasn't just about a small-town judge or a single courtroom incident. It was about a movement, one that she intended to lead. In the days that followed Alicia's television interview, the media circus surrounding the courthouse incident showed no signs of waning. While the public outpouring of support was significant, it came with a tidal wave of criticism. Every word she spoke was dissected, every action she took analyzed under the microscope of public opinion. As the dust settled, it became clear to Alicia that this moment, though seemingly a simple case of judicial overstep, was quickly transforming into something much larger. A direct challenge to the way society viewed power, race, and gender. Inside her office, Alicia sat with Marcus, the weight of the situation settling in as they reviewed the latest batch of social media reactions and news articles. The initial support had been overwhelming, but now the attacks were becoming more targeted, more vicious. Her opponents had found a new angle. They were framing her as someone who was using her position to make a spectacle of a minor situation, accusing her of playing the race card to gain political advantage. They claimed her actions were creating division rather than encouraging progress. "People are angry, Alicia," Marcus said, his voice tight as he scrolled through yet another round of hostile comments. "Some are accusing you of turning this into a national drama for your own benefit. They're calling it an abuse of your power." Alicia glanced up at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "And that's exactly what they want people to believe, that I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, that I'm just an opportunist. But what they don't understand is that this isn't about a fine. It's about everything else that comes with it." Marcus met her gaze, his brow furrowed. "But the message is being muddied, Alicia. You're up against a system that's trying to downplay the real issue. They're trying to say you're making something out of nothing." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping on the desk in a rhythmic pattern. She'd anticipated this sort of response. It was a classic play from the political playbook: discredit the person, attack their credibility, and downplay the larger issues they're trying to raise. But Alicia had spent her life fighting for things that mattered. She wasn't about to let them win this time. "I know," she said, her voice unwavering. "But this is bigger than just me. This isn't about my political career or some petty personal vendetta. This is about every single person who has ever been ignored, belittled, or dismissed because of who they are, what they look like, where they come from, and the assumptions made about them before they even speak. This court case was just the spark. It's time to fan the flames." Marcus nodded, understanding her resolve. "But how can we shift the conversation? The media's already framing it as a personal issue. They're focusing on the drama instead of the message." Alicia's expression grew steely. "We take control. We stop waiting for them to define the narrative and create our own. It's time to bring in the stories that matter, the voices that are always overlooked. The following week, Alicia made a bold decision. She called for a press conference, not to apologize or back down, but to amplify the voices of those who had experienced similar injustices. She brought in community leaders, activists, and citizens who had faced systemic bias in the judicial system. The press conference was not about her. It was about everyone who had ever been unfairly treated or dismissed. She knew that this would be her opportunity to show the world that her fight was part of a larger, ongoing battle against the system that often failed to recognize the humanity of those outside its narrow, privileged boundaries. As the cameras rolled and microphones were raised, Alicia stood in front of the crowd, her words carefully chosen. "This is not just about a judge's mistake," she began, her voice strong. "This is about all of us, about how too many people are still ignored, undervalued, and discriminated against. Today, we stand together, not as victims of an isolated incident, but as champions of justice. We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for equality. We are asking for a system that sees us all, not as cases or statistics, but as human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The room fell silent as her words echoed. There was no sensationalism, no drama, just the raw, honest truth of what had happened. And slowly, the tide began to turn. The public's focus shifted, and instead of seeing Alicia as someone who had created a spectacle, they began to see her as someone who was taking. But Alicia knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was not in front of the cameras. It was behind the scenes, in the corridors of power, where decisions were made and lives were shaped. And she was ready for whatever came next. A stand for something much greater. In the weeks following the press conference, Alicia's efforts began to gain significant traction. The media, once focused on the drama surrounding the courthouse incident, now turned its gaze toward the broader implications of her message. As the headlines evolved, so too did the conversation. No longer was she the disgruntled governor making a fuss over a minor issue. Instead, she had become a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice, a figurehead for those who had long been marginalized. Alicia had always known the power of narrative. She knew that in politics, the story you told could make or break you. And now she was telling the story of a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. A woman who was finally using her voice to challenge the very systems that sought to silence her. The more the public saw of her, the more they realized that this wasn't about a simple court case. It was about power, and more importantly, who got to wield it. Her office was filled with advisors and strategists, each one contributing their perspective on how to keep the momentum going. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, but Alicia knew that public opinion could be fleeting. The trick was not to get swept away in the tide, but to guide it in a direction that would bring about real change. "I want to push for a full review of judicial practices across the state," Alicia announced during one of their meetings, her voice resolute. "We need to address the systemic issues that lead to situations like this. This isn't about one bad judge. It's about a larger culture of entitlement that exists within our legal system. If we can bring transparency and accountability to these courts, we can create real reform." Marcus looked up from the stack of reports on his desk. "That's ambitious, Alicia. It'll take time, and you're bound to face pushback. Are you ready for that?" Alicia nodded, unfazed. "I've always been ready for that. The bigger the challenge, the greater the reward. And right now, the people are listening." The next step was to gather allies. Alicia knew that pushing for judicial reform would require a coalition of powerful figures who were committed to making a change. She reached out to state legislators, influential community leaders, and civil rights advocates. Slowly, the network of support around her began to grow. What had started as a single issue had now become part of a larger conversation about the state's judicial system, one that no one could afford to ignore. Meanwhile, Judge Langford, the man at the center of it all, found himself at a crossroads. The public backlash he had faced was intense. He had been publicly ridiculed, and his career was now under intense scrutiny. His colleagues and peers had distanced themselves from him, some even suggesting that he should resign for the sake of his reputation and the integrity of the court system. Langford, however, remained defiant. He had spent decades in the judicial system and wasn't about to be taken down by what he saw as a media frenzy. Still, even he couldn't ignore the growing pressure. His actions had forced the hand of a political force far greater than he had realized. Alicia's movement had begun to spark something, and as much as he tried to convince himself it would all blow over, he couldn't deny the fact that his decision in that courtroom had placed him at the epicenter of a national conversation. He needed to do something, but what? One morning, Alicia's phone rang. It was an unexpected call, one she had not been prepared for. Governor Lawson, a voice on the other end began. "This is Judge Richard Langford. I'd like to meet with you, if you're willing." Alicia was momentarily taken aback. The judge, who had shown her nothing but indifference and dismissal, was now requesting a meeting. Something had changed. Something had shifted. "I'm listening," she replied, her tone cool and measured. "I believe there are things we can discuss that may help us move forward," Langford continued. "I understand now that my actions were part of a larger issue, and I want to be part of the solution. I'm requesting a meeting to discuss what steps I can take to make amends and ensure this doesn't happen again." Alicia's mind raced. The situation had evolved into something far more complex than she had anticipated, but this was the moment she had been waiting for. Langford's request was a sign that the power dynamics were shifting. What started as a small incident in a courtroom had now led to an unprecedented opportunity to reshape the system from within. "I'll meet you," Alicia said, her voice firm. "But let's make one thing clear. This conversation isn't just about you or me. It's about accountability. It's about real change. If you're committed to that, then we can talk." As she hung up the phone, Alicia felt a strange sense of calm. The battle was far from over, but the first cracks in the old system were beginning to appear. Now it was time to see if they could be widened. Alicia walked into the meeting room with a quiet determination, the weight of her role pressing on her shoulders, but also filling her with a sense of purpose. The conversation with Judge Langford, once unthinkable, was now imminent. She had seen this moment coming, a day when the resistance would start to soften, when those who had once turned a blind eye to the injustice would begin to realize that change was not just necessary, it was inevitable. The meeting room was elegant but unassuming, with a polished wooden table and a few chairs arranged in a circle. Langford was already seated, his posture rigid but his expression surprisingly neutral. He stood as she entered, extending his hand, but Alicia only nodded, taking her seat without offering her hand. She wasn't here for pleasantries. She was here to have a conversation that mattered. Langford cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Governor Lawson, I want to start by saying that I regret what happened in that courtroom. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation at the time, and for that, I am truly sorry." Alicia studied him carefully. She had heard these words from others before. Politicians, public figures, even those with less power than Langford, who claimed to regret their actions only when the public spotlight burned too hot. She could not afford to be fooled by mere apologies. The question now was whether Langford was genuinely ready to confront the deeper issues at play. "Regret is a start," she replied, her voice measured. "But it's not enough. Words are easy. Action is what counts. What are you willing to do to address the systemic issues that led to this? What are you willing to do to ensure that no one else is dismissed or ignored in the way you dismissed me?" Langford sat back, his eyes flickering with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. He had spent most of his career believing that the system he upheld was fair, that it was blind to race, gender, and status. But now, as Alicia's words sank in, he was beginning to see the cracks in that belief. He had been part of the system, not a reformer, and he had failed to notice the inequities that lay beneath its surface. "I want to help," Langford said slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, the way people like you are dismissed, how the system doesn't see them for who they really are. I was wrong, and I'm ready to learn from my mistakes. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want to be part of the solution." Alicia studied him for a long moment, sensing the sincerity in his words, but actions would speak louder than any apology. The solution begins with accountability, she said firmly. And accountability means examining the system as a whole, not just your own actions. It's about recognizing the biases that are embedded in the structure. It's about making sure that no one, no matter their race, gender, or background, is ever treated as less than. Langford nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand that, but where do we start? How do we even begin to tackle something so deep-rooted? Alicia leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. It starts with honesty. We need to have difficult conversations about privilege, about power, and about what justice really means. The courts need to be reformed, yes, but so do the people who operate within them. That means taking a hard look at who gets to sit on the bench and why. We need to ensure that our judiciary reflects the diversity of the people it serves. We also need to create mandatory bias training for judges and court staff to begin dismantling the assumptions that shape their decisions. Langford was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. Alicia could tell that he was trying to reconcile the idea of change with the life he had built within the very system he now found himself questioning. It wasn't easy. Change never was. But she could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a shift that told her he was beginning to understand just how far-reaching the problem was. Your vision is ambitious, Langford said finally, but I'm willing to work with you. If you can get the support you need, if you can bring others to the table, I'll stand with you. I want to be part of making this right. Alicia nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew that Langford's words, while a step in the right direction, were just the beginning. She would need to hold him accountable, just as she planned to hold everyone in power accountable. But this meeting, in its raw honesty and its commitment to change, was the first true step towards something meaningful. The road ahead won't be easy, Alicia said, standing up from the table, but we have to start somewhere. And today, we take that first step. Langford stood as well, offering her a nod of agreement. Alicia didn't need to hear more. The real work had begun. As she left the room, she knew the battle was far from over, but she also knew this. Sometimes, the hardest part of change was getting the people who had the power to listen. And today, for the first time, she believed Langford was listening. That was progress. That was everything. The weeks following Alicia's meeting with Judge Langford were intense, but the momentum she had been building could not be ignored. The press coverage continued to evolve, but now, it wasn't just about the courthouse incident. It was about the promise of real change. Alicia's vision for reform had caught fire, drawing the attention of politicians, activists, and citizens alike. Her words had given people hope, but hope needed action to become something tangible. Alicia knew that the hardest part of any movement wasn't starting it, it was sustaining it. The legal reforms she sought would not happen overnight, and the pushback from powerful forces within the judicial system was inevitable. But she had never been one to back down. She had spent her career fighting for those whose voices had been silenced, and she wasn't about to stop now. The state legislature had convened to discuss the proposed judicial reforms. Alicia stood at the podium, addressing the room with a mixture of passion and authority. She spoke about the need for diversity in the judiciary, the importance of unbiased training for judges, and the necessity of holding those in power accountable. Her message was clear. The system needed to change, and she was determined to make that happen. This isn't just about one judge, Alicia said, her voice steady. It's about a system that has failed to reflect the diversity of the people it serves. It's about a system that has perpetuated injustice for far too long. The time for change is now, and we must all be a part of that change. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. There were murmurs of agreement from the progressive side of the legislature, but there were also dissenting voices, those who felt that the reforms were too radical, too sweeping. They argued that the judiciary was already a well-functioning system and that these changes were unnecessary, perhaps even dangerous. Alicia knew that these voices would be her biggest challenge, but she had faced opposition before. Change is hard, Alicia continued, her gaze sweeping over the room. I know that, but it's necessary. The people of this state deserve better. They deserve a justice system that treats them equally, no matter who they are. And that's what we're here to create. The debate was fierce. Supporters of the reforms rallied behind Alicia, but those opposed used every tool at their disposal to derail the movement. They questioned the practicality of her proposals, accusing her of overreaching and politicizing the judicial system. Some suggested that the push for reform was based on a personal vendetta against one judge, a claim Alicia quickly dismissed, clarifying once again that this wasn't about one individual. It was about an entire system that needed to evolve. As the days turned into weeks, the political struggle intensified. Alicia's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, building coalitions and gathering data to support the need for reform. They organized town halls, held private meetings with lawmakers, and mobilized grassroots support. But no matter how much progress they made, the fight for change seemed to be a constant uphill battle. Then, just when it seemed as though the reforms might stall, Alicia received an unexpected call. It was Judge Langford. He had been under increasing pressure from his peers, many of whom had grown uneasy with the rising tide of public opinion. Some had even suggested that his resignation might be the only way to quell the growing unrest. But Langford had made a decision. "I've thought long and hard about this," he said on the phone. "I'm not perfect, but I'm committed to making things right. I'll support your reforms, Alicia. I'll stand by you." Alicia was taken aback. Langford had come a long way since their first meeting. This wasn't just a public endorsement, it was a sign that he had truly begun to understand the magnitude of the changes that needed to happen. She had expected resistance, even from him, but now she realized that change was starting to take hold, even in places she hadn't anticipated. "I appreciate that, Judge," Alicia replied, her voice calm but filled with gratitude. "But words aren't enough. We need action. We need to work together to create the kind of system that serves everyone, not just the privileged few." Langford was quiet for a moment before responding. "I know. I'm ready to help." In the following months, Alicia and Langford worked side by side, pushing forward with the reforms they had both come to believe in. The road wasn't easy, and there were still many battles to fight, but for the first time in a long while, Alicia felt a sense of hope. The changes she had envisioned were beginning to take shape, and more importantly, they were becoming a reality. By the end of the year, the state legislature had passed a sweeping package of judicial reforms, including mandatory bias training for all judges, increased diversity in the appointment process, and greater accountability for those in power. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Alicia knew that this was just the beginning, that there was still much work to be done. But as she stood on the steps of the state capitol, watching the sunset over the horizon, she knew that she had started something that could not be stopped. The fight for justice was far from over, but now the system had begun to change.